You'll regret this. Linda's voice cut through the room like a knife, the calm of her tone, a mask for the fury I saw in her eyes. She stood in the doorway, her figure framed by the soft glow of the afternoon sun behind her. There was something almost ethereal about the scene, until you noticed the hard set of her jaw, the faint quiver in her lip, and the way her hands clenched around the edges of her designer coat. I was standing by the window, my hands gripping the sill so tightly my knuckles had turned white. My heart pounded in my chest, loud enough that I wondered if she could hear it too. But I didn't flinch. I didn't back down. Her words echoed in the stillness between us. "You'll regret this," she repeated, as if she was promising it, like some sort of prophecy she was certain would come true. I didn't answer her. Not out loud, at least. But inside my voice was clear. Maybe I will, but not today. For a moment, neither of us moved. Her heels clicked softly on the hardwood floor as she stepped closer, her expression softening into something almost gentle. Almost. "You're making a mistake," she said. "A mistake you won't be able to undo." I swallowed hard, the taste of fear sharp on my tongue. My palms were damp, the weight of her presence pressing into me from across the room. But I refused to let her see the doubt flickering in my eyes. I forced my shoulders back and lifted my chin. "I've made mistakes before," I said finally, my voice quiet but steady. "But this isn't one of them." Linda's smile was slow and cold, curving up at the corners, like the blade of a knife. "You always were so stubborn," she said softly. "So sure of yourself. It'll be your undoing, you know. That pride." She paused, her eyes drifting over me, with a mixture of pity and disdain. "I tried to warn you," she said, her voice almost a whisper. "But you never listen." I took a breath, steadying myself. Outside the window, the world seemed to pause. A leaf drifted lazily to the ground. The wind whispered through the branches of the old oak in the front yard. For a moment, I remembered how we used to sit under that tree, two girls sharing secrets, and laughter, and dreams for the future. But that was before. Before everything changed. Before she became the one I couldn't trust. Before her betrayal turned my home into a battlefield. "I'm not afraid of you anymore," I said quietly. Her eyes narrowed, and for the briefest instant, I saw a flicker of uncertainty there. But it vanished as quickly as it had come, replaced by a look of cold amusement. "We'll see," she said simply. She took another step closer, close enough that I could see the faint lines around her eyes, the small imperfection in her lipstick, where she'd bitten her lip too hard. "I know you better than anyone," she murmured. "I know exactly what buttons to push, exactly how to make you break." I clenched my fists at my sides, nails digging into my palms, until I felt the sharp sting of pain. It was grounding, reminding me that I wasn't the same woman she used to know. I wasn't fragile anymore, and I wasn't going to let her win. The silence stretched between us again, thick and heavy. She tilted her head, studying me like I was some puzzle she couldn't quite solve. "Fine," she said finally, her voice light and airy, as if we were talking about something as trivial as the weather. "Have it your way?" She turned to leave, her heels clicking on the floor, like a metronome marking the beat of my racing heart. But just before she stepped out the door, she paused, glancing back at me over her shoulder. "You'll regret this," she said again, her voice low and sure. Then she was gone. For a moment, I just stood there, staring at the empty doorway. My legs felt like they might give out beneath me, but I refused to let them. I turned back to the window, taking a deep breath. The sun was slipping lower in the sky, painting the world in gold and shadow. It was beautiful in a way that felt almost cruel. I pressed my forehead to the cool glass, closing my eyes. "You'll regret this." The words still echoed in my mind, but they didn't scare me anymore. Not like they once would have. I had spent years living in fear of her, of the power she held over me, of the way she could twist my words and my actions into weapons against me. I had let her control me for too long, let her whispers of doubt sink into my bones, until I almost believed them myself. But not anymore. I had learned to trust my instincts again, to stand on my own 2 feet, even when the ground beneath me felt unsteady. I opened my eyes and lifted my head. In the glass, I saw my own reflection, tired maybe, a little older than I remembered, but strong, stronger than I had ever been. I let out a breath slow and steady. My fingers loosened their grip on the windowsill, the pain in my palms fading to a dull throb. Linda thought she knew me. She thought she could still bend me to her will the way she always had. But she was wrong. Because today, I wasn't the one who was going to break. Today, I wasn't the one who would be left with regrets. I stepped away from the window, my footsteps quiet but sure. There was a small smile on my lips as I turned back to the empty room, the last of the daylight catching in my hair. For the first time in a long time, I felt free. "You'll regret this," she had said. But in my heart, I knew the truth. She would be the one to regret it. The days that followed felt like walking on broken glass. Every step I took seemed to cut a little deeper, but I kept moving forward anyway. Linda's words still echoed in my head, sharp lingering, a ghost of a threat I couldn't quite shake. But I refused to let them control me. I woke up every morning determined to hold my ground, to remind myself that I was stronger than she thought. Yet in the quiet hours of the night, when the house was still and the darkness pressed in around me, I couldn't help but feel the sting of her betrayal all over again. I remembered the nights we'd spent talking until dawn, sharing dreams and secrets over cups of cold coffee. I remembered how she used to braid my hair when I was too tired to do it myself, how she'd laugh and tell me I was beautiful even when I felt anything but. Those memories were like old photographs, edges worn and fading, but still they're still real. I thought about the woman she'd become, the cold calculation in her voice, the way her smile never quite reached her eyes anymore. It was like watching someone you loved turn into a stranger right before your eyes. And maybe that was what hurt the most, that the person who had once held my hand through heartbreak was now the one trying to break me apart. I tried to bury those thoughts to focus on the small, steady routines of my days. I cleaned the kitchen, folded the laundry, made dinner, with careful precision, each act a silent promise to myself that I was still here, still fighting. But no matter how many dishes I scrubbed or how many shirts I ironed, I couldn't scrub away the ache in my chest. My husband, Mark, noticed the change in me. He tried to pretend everything was normal, but I could see the worry in his eyes. He'd reach for my hand across the table, his thumb brushing over my knuckles, in a silent question I didn't know how to answer. I wanted to tell him everything, to pour out the tangled mess of my fears and doubts, to let him see the places where I was cracked and splintering. But every time I opened my mouth, the words died on my tongue. How could I explain that the woman who had once been my closest friend was now the source of my deepest pain? That the betrayal I carried was like a stone in my chest, heavy and unyielding? So I stayed silent. I smiled when he asked if I was okay, and I said yes, even though the truth was something else entirely. At night, I lay in bed listening to the soft, steady rhythm of his breathing and wondered if he could feel the distance growing between us. One evening, as I was setting the table for dinner, he came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist. His chin rested on my shoulder, and for a moment, I let myself lean into his warmth. "You've been quiet lately," he said softly. "Is everything all right?" I hesitated, my hands trembling just slightly as I set down the last fork. "I'm fine," I said. The lie tasted bitter, but I couldn't find the strength to tell the truth. He didn't push, just kissed my temple and murmured that he loved me. I wanted to believe that was enough, that his love could patch over the cracks in my heart. But some wounds go deeper than even love can reach. Later that night, I sat alone in the living room, the glow of the lamp casting long shadows across the walls. I traced the edge of my coffee cup with my fingertip, lost in thought. Linda's face kept swimming up in my mind, her eyes glinting with a mixture of challenge and disdain. "You'll regret this." I almost laughed at the memory, because maybe there was a part of me that did regret it, regret the years I'd spent believing in her, trusting her with pieces of my soul she'd never deserved. But as I sat there in the quiet, I realized something else too. Maybe regret wasn't the worst thing in the world. Maybe it was a sign that you'd finally seen the truth, that you were ready to stop pretending and start fighting for yourself. I thought about the way Linda had looked at me that day, so certain, so sure of her power over me. But she didn't know the woman I was becoming. She didn't know that every betrayal, every bitter word, had forged me into something stronger. I set my coffee cup down and stood the weight of my resolve settling over me like a second skin. I wasn't going to let her dictate the story of my life any longer. The next morning, I woke up early, the sky outside still dark and hushed. I stood at the window and watched the first pale light of dawn creep over the horizon. There was a quiet strength in that soft, steady glow, like a promise that even the longest nights couldn't last forever. I thought about Linda's threats, her laughter ringing in my ears. And I thought about the woman I was becoming, the woman who refused to be broken. I knew the days ahead wouldn't be easy. There would be moments when doubt would creep in, when the old wounds would ache, and the weight of it all would feel like too much to bear. But I also knew I had survived this far. And I wasn't done yet. As I stepped away from the window, a small smile curved my lips. Linda had warned me that I'd regret this. But she was wrong. Because the only thing I regretted was not standing up for myself sooner. And I knew deep in my bones that she would be the one to carry the burden of regret, not me. The days blurred together in a haze of routine, each one a mirror of the last. I woke early, made coffee, and watched the sun paint the world in soft gold through the kitchen window. I moved through my chores like a ghost, each task a quiet rebellion against the chaos that had invaded my life. But even as I went through the motions, there was a part of me that felt like it was waking up for the first time in years. It started small, tiny cracks in the walls I'd built around my heart. A flicker of anger when Linda's voice echoed in my mind, a whisper of resolve that told me I didn't have to accept the way things were. I found myself staring into the mirror in the bathroom one morning, searching for the woman I used to be. My reflection looked tired eyes, shadowed by sleepless nights, but there was something else there too, a glimmer of defiance that hadn't been there before. I touched my fingertips to the glass, as if I could reach through and pull that strength into myself. I remembered how Linda used to stand behind me, fixing my hair, and telling me how pretty I looked. How safe I'd felt in her friendship, how certain I'd been that she'd always be on my side. But those memories felt like they belonged to someone else now, some naive girl who didn't know how quickly loyalty could turn into betrayal. One afternoon, Mark came home early from work. I was in the kitchen, the scent of lemon and thyme rising from the skillet on the stove. He wrapped his arms around me from behind his breath, warm against my neck. "You're quiet today," he said. I stirred the pan slowly, feeling the weight of his concern settle over me. "Just thinking," I said softly. "About her?" he asked. His voice was gentle, but I could hear the strain in it, the way he was trying to hold back his own doubts and fears. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. He sighed and rested his chin on my shoulder. "You don't have to go through this alone," he said. "I know," I whispered. And I did. But there was a part of me that felt like this was something only I could face. Linda's betrayal wasn't just a wound, it was a mirror showing me all the places I'd given up pieces of myself to keep the peace. I couldn't run from that anymore. Later that night, after Mark had fallen asleep, I sat in the dark and let the memories come. I saw Linda's smile so sweet and bright when we were young. I heard her laughter, felt the weight of her arm around my shoulders as we planned our futures together. And then I saw the way her eyes had turned cold, the way her words had cut me to the bone. "You'll regret this." I thought about those words, about the way she'd said them like a curse. But I realized then that they weren't a prophecy, they were a challenge I was finally ready to meet. The next morning, I pulled out the old shoebox I'd kept hidden in the back of the closet. It was filled with scraps of paper, old photographs, and the memories of a friendship I'd once believed would last forever. My hands shook as I sorted through them, but I didn't stop. I needed to see it all to remind myself of who I was and who I wasn't anymore. There was a picture of us at the beach, laughing as the wind whipped our hair around our faces. I stared at it for a long moment, trying to remember what it felt like to trust her without hesitation. But those days were gone. I slipped the photo back into the box and closed the lid with a quiet finality. That afternoon, I went for a walk around the neighborhood. The air was crisp, the sky a brilliant blue above me. I let the cold bite at my cheeks, the sharp air filling my lungs and clearing the fog from my mind. I thought about the woman I was becoming, the woman who refused to be defined by someone else's betrayal. As I walked, I felt something shift inside me. The weight of Linda's threats, the shadows of her manipulations, they didn't feel so heavy anymore. They were still there, but they weren't holding me hostage. I was done letting her words dictate the shape of my days. When I got home, I found Mark waiting for me on the porch. He looked up as I climbed the steps, his eyes searching mine. "You okay?" he asked. I nodded. "I'm getting there," I said. And for the first time, I meant it. That night, I dreamed of Linda. In the dream, she was standing in a field of tall grass, the wind tugging at her hair. She reached out a hand to me, her eyes soft and pleading. "Come back," she whispered. But in the dream, I shook my head and turned away. I woke up with tears on my cheeks, but they weren't tears of sorrow. They were tears of release, because I knew I wasn't going back, not to her, not to the way things used to be. The next morning, I took a deep breath and made a decision. I picked up my phone and called her. When she answered, her voice was smooth and calm, like nothing had ever happened. "I was wondering when you'd call," she said. "I'm done," I told her. My voice was steady, each word, a quiet act of defiance. "I'm done letting you control my life." There was a pause on the other end of the line, and then she laughed, a soft, mocking sound. "We'll see," she said. But I didn't care. I hung up the phone and set it down, my hands trembling, but my heart steady. In that moment, I felt something inside me settle. Linda might never understand what she'd lost, but I did. I had found something worth more than her friendship or her approval. I had found my own strength, and I knew with a certainty that burned bright in my chest that I would never let her take that away from me again. The morning air was cold as I stepped outside a sharp bite that made me pull my coat tighter around my shoulders. I walked down the path that led from the porch to the street, each step deliberate, each breath steady. I was done letting Linda's words echo in my mind like some dark mantra. Done letting her poison linger in the corners of my thoughts. As I walked, I thought about the small ways I had begun to reclaim pieces of myself. The simple routines that felt like lifelines in a world that had been turned upside down. Cooking meals that smelled like home. Folding warm laundry fresh from the dryer. Letting the steam from my coffee cup swirl around me as I watched the sunrise. They were small things, maybe, but they were mine. And they reminded me that I could still shape my own days, no matter how much Linda had tried to steal that from me. I paused at the end of the path, my breath clouding in the cold. The world felt quiet in that moment. No cars passing by, no birds singing in the trees. Just the soft hush of winter settling over everything like a blanket. I closed my eyes and let that silence wash over me, a calm that felt almost sacred. Linda had always thrived on noise, on chaos, on drama, on the rush of having everyone's attention fixed on her. But I was learning that strength didn't always roar. Sometimes it was quiet. Sometimes it was the steady beat of your own heart as you chose yourself again and again. I opened my eyes and turned back to the house, ready to face whatever waited inside. Mark was sitting at the kitchen table when I walked in, a mug of coffee cradled in his hands. He looked up at me, his eyes warm and steady. "Morning," he said, his voice gentle. "Morning," I replied, my voice stronger than I felt. I poured myself a cup of coffee and sat down across from him. For a moment, we just sat there in silence, the steam rising between us. Then he reached across the table and took my hand in his. "I know things have been hard," he said quietly. "I know you're carrying more than you're saying." My throat tightened, but I nodded. He squeezed my hand. "Whatever it is, whatever you decide, I'm with you," he said. "I need you to know that." I looked into his eyes, seeing the worry there, the love that had never wavered. And for the first time in a long time, I let myself believe it. "Thank you," I said softly. He smiled, a small curve of his lips that warmed me from the inside out. Always, he said. Later that afternoon, I sat in the living room with a box of old letters spread out around me. Letters from Linda, some sweet and silly, others heavy with secrets we'd once sworn to keep. I read each one slowly, letting the words sink in, letting the memories wash over me like a tide. Some of them made me smile, remembering the girl I'd once been, and the friendship I'd thought would last forever. Others made my heart ache, a dull throb that reminded me of everything we'd lost. But as I read, I realized something important. Those letters weren't just memories. They were proof. Proof of the woman I'd been. Proof of the trust I'd given so freely. Proof that I wasn't imagining the bond we'd shared, that it had been real, even if it had ended in betrayal. I gathered the letters into a neat stack and tied them with a ribbon, a small act of closure. I didn't need to keep them hidden away anymore. I didn't need to pretend they didn't matter. They were part of my story, but they didn't define it. That night, I found the courage to tell Mark everything. We sat on the couch, the soft glow of the lamp casting long shadows on the walls. I told him about Linda's threats, about the way she'd tried to twist my life into something I didn't recognize. I told him about the fear that had kept me silent for so long, about the anger that had finally pushed me to speak. He listened without interrupting, his hand warm on my knee, his eyes never leaving mine. When I finished, there was a long moment of quiet. Then he pulled me close, his arms wrapping around me like a shield. "You didn't deserve any of that," he said softly. I let out a shaky breath, the tears I'd been holding back slipping free. "I know," I whispered. And I did. Finally. In the days that followed, I felt lighter somehow. The weight of Linda's threats, the guilt that had clung to me like a second skin, it was still there, but it didn't feel so suffocating anymore. I started to see the small ways I'd let her voice shape the way I saw myself, the doubts she'd planted, the fears she'd fed, and I realized that the only way to take that power back was to let those fears live in the light, to name them, to face them. One evening, I found myself standing at the window, watching the last light of day slip away. The sky was painted in soft shades of pink and gold, the world hushed and waiting. I thought about Linda, about the way she'd laughed when she thought she'd won, about the way she'd looked at me like I was something fragile, something breakable. But I wasn't that woman anymore. I was done letting her see me as anything less than whole. I closed my eyes and took a deep breath, feeling the quiet strength of that moment settle into my bones. And when I opened them again, I knew that whatever came next, I was ready. Ready to face her. Ready to fight for the life I wanted, the life I deserved. Linda had said I'd regret this. But as I stood there, the night wrapping around me like a promise, I knew one thing for certain. I wouldn't. Not now. Not ever. Morning light crept through the curtains, casting a soft glow across the room. I lay there for a moment, listening to the quiet of the house around me. There was something almost sacred about that hush, like the world was holding its breath. I thought about the road I'd traveled to get here, all the nights spent doubting myself, all the mornings waking up with a weight in my chest, and I thought about how far I'd come. Linda's voice still lingered in my mind sometimes, like a ghost haunting the edges of my thoughts. But it didn't have the same power over me anymore. Her threats, her laughter, it all felt like echoes of a world I'd left behind. I got out of bed and walked to the window, pulling the curtains aside to watch the sun rise. The sky was streaked with gold and pink, a promise of something new. I wrapped my arms around myself, feeling the warmth of that promise settle into my bones. I had spent so long waiting, waiting for Linda to change, waiting for the pain to fade, waiting for the strength I thought I'd never find. But I wasn't waiting anymore. I was done living in the shadow of what she'd done, done letting her shape the way I saw myself. I turned away from the window and started getting ready for the day. As I moved through the morning routine, coffee brewing, dishes clinking in the sink, I felt a sense of calm settle over me. It wasn't that everything was perfect. There were still scars, still wounds that ached when I least expected them. But I was no longer defined by those wounds. I was more than the pain she'd tried to leave me with. Mark was already in the kitchen when I walked in, his eyes bright with quiet relief. He smiled when he saw me, and for the first time in a long time, I let that smile settle into my heart without hesitation. "You look peaceful," he said. I nodded, feeling the truth of that in every breath I took. "I feel peaceful," I said. And I did. That morning, I sat at the table with a cup of coffee warming my hands, and I made a decision. I was done carrying the weight of Linda's betrayal. I was done letting it shape the way I moved through the world. She had tried to break me, but all she'd done was reveal a strength I hadn't known I had. I thought about the way she'd looked at me that last time we spoke, so sure of her power, so certain I would bend to her will, and I realized that her power only existed because I'd let it, because I'd believed her words more than I believed in myself, but not anymore. I set my coffee cup down and stood my heart steady in my chest. It was time to close this chapter, to let go of the hold she'd had on me. I pulled out my phone and scrolled through my contacts until I found her name. My thumb hovered over it for a moment, but I didn't hesitate. I hit delete. Just like that, she was gone from my phone. It was a small act, but it felt monumental. A line drawn in the sand, a boundary set in stone. She no longer had a place in my life, no longer had a claim on my heart. Mark watched me from across the room, his expression soft and proud. "You're really done, aren't you?" he asked. I nodded. "I am," I said, and I meant it. Later that day, I took a walk through the neighborhood, the crisp air filling my lungs and clearing my mind. I thought about the woman I'd been when this all started, so unsure, so afraid of what might happen if I stood up for myself. And I thought about the woman I was now, steadier, stronger, and unafraid of what came next. Linda's threats no longer felt like chains around my ankles. They were just words spoken by someone who had lost her hold on me. When I got home, I found Mark waiting for me on the porch. He stood up when he saw me, his smile wide and warm. "How was your walk?" he asked. "Good," I said, and it was. More than good, it felt like a promise to myself, a promise to keep moving forward no matter what. We spent the evening together in quiet comfort, sharing a meal, laughing at small things, and letting the simple peace of it all settle around us like a blanket. And as the night wore on, I felt something shift inside me. The past no longer felt like a weight pulling me under. It felt like a stepping stone, a lesson learned and left behind. I went to bed that night with a sense of quiet certainty in my heart. Linda had said I would regret this, but as I lay there in the soft darkness, Mark's hand resting warm and steady in mine, I knew she was wrong. I didn't regret standing up for myself. I didn't regret drawing a line and refusing to let her cross it again. What I would have regretted was staying silent, letting her keep taking pieces of me until there was nothing left. And as I drifted off to sleep, I knew that whatever came next, I was ready. I had faced the worst of her manipulations and come out the other side stronger. I had found my voice again, and I wasn't going to let anyone take it from me. Not Linda. Not anyone. The final words she had thrown at me, her threats, her promises of regret, no longer had any power here. I had built something stronger, something that couldn't be touched by her bitterness. I had built a life that was mine, a life filled with love and quiet strength. And in the end, that was all I needed. As the night wrapped around me, and I let sleep take me, I knew that I had made the right choice. I didn't regret it, and she would be the one to carry the weight of that truth. Winter was fading when the knock came at the door. I was in the kitchen, hands deep in a bowl of warm bread dough, the smell of yeast and flour comforting in its simplicity. The sound startled me, a sharp rap against the wooden door that felt out of place in the quiet rhythm of my morning. I wiped my hands on a towel and went to answer it, my heart suddenly uneasy in my chest. When I opened the door, Linda was standing there. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Her eyes searched my face, and I could see the faint lines around them, the weariness she tried so hard to hide. She looked different, more fragile somehow, but the defiance was still there in the set of her shoulders. "Can we talk?" she asked finally, her voice quiet. I hesitated, the weight of her presence pressing against me like a storm. I wasn't sure I was ready to weather. But I stepped back and let her in the old habit of politeness, hard to break even now. She walked into the living room and stood by the window, her fingers trailing over the dusty frame. "You've redecorated," she said almost absently. "It's nice." I didn't respond. I didn't trust my voice to be steady, not with her standing there like a ghost from a past I thought I'd buried. She turned to face me, her expression carefully neutral. "I know I'm probably the last person you want to see," she began, "but I needed to talk to you. To explain." I crossed my arms over my chest, steadying myself. "Explain what I asked," my voice calm. She took a deep breath, her shoulders slumping. Everything she said simply. The things I did. The things I said. For a long moment, we just looked at each other. I saw the flicker of something real in her eyes, regret maybe, or the faint echo of the friendship we'd once shared. But I didn't let myself get lost in that. Not this time. "Why now?" I asked, my tone sharper than I intended. She winced. "Because I thought you deserved to hear it from me," she said. "I've been carrying this with me for so long, and it's eating me alive." I felt a pang of something I didn't want to name. Pity, maybe. Or the ghost of the girl who had once believed Linda would always be there to catch her when she fell. "You said I'd regret standing up for myself," I said quietly. "You said I'd regret cutting you out." She closed her eyes, her jaw tightening. "I know," she whispered. "And for a long time I wanted that to be true. I wanted you to feel as lost as I did. But now—" She opened her eyes and met my gaze, and I saw something raw there. "Now I just want you to know I'm sorry." The words hung in the air between us, heavy and unfamiliar. I didn't know what to do with them, didn't know how to let them in without reopening every wound she'd left behind. "I don't know if I can believe you," I said, my voice soft but steady. She nodded, her shoulders sagging. "I wouldn't expect you to," she said. "I don't deserve that." But I had to try. She took a step closer, and I could see how hard she was fighting to hold herself together. "I thought if I could make you doubt yourself, I could keep you close," she said, her voice breaking. "I thought if I could make you afraid to let go, I wouldn't have to face what I'd done." I swallowed hard, the truth of her words slicing through me like a blade. "And now?" I asked. She looked down at her hands, fingers twisting together. "Now I see that I was wrong," she said. "I see that the only thing I did was push you away. And I hate that it took losing you to understand that." For a moment, I didn't say anything. I let the weight of her confession settle in the quiet room. Then I took a deep breath and spoke. "I'm not the same person I was back then," I said. "I've learned how to stand on my own, how to live without your approval or your forgiveness." She looked up, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "I know," she said, "and I'm glad. You deserve to be free of all of this." I studied her for a long moment, searching for the girl I'd once trusted. She was still there, buried under the layers of bitterness and regret. But she wasn't mine to save. "I accept your apology," I said finally, the words tasting strange, but true. "But I can't let you back in. Not now. Not ever." She nodded, a single tear slipping down her cheek. "I understand," she whispered. "Thank you for hearing me out." She turned and walked to the door, pausing with her hand on the knob. "I hope one day you'll find it in your heart to forgive me," she said. I didn't answer. There were some wounds that forgiveness couldn't heal, some truths that couldn't be undone. As the door clicked shut behind her, I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. I stood there for a long moment, the quiet of the house wrapping around me like a balm. I thought about the girl I'd once been, the woman I was now, and the line that separated them. Linda's apology didn't erase the past, but it didn't define my future either. I was done letting her voice shape the way I saw myself, done letting her regrets become my burden to carry. I turned away from the door and walked back into the kitchen, the smell of bread still warm and comforting in the air. There was a peace in that moment, a quiet resolve that settled into my bones. Linda had returned to say she was sorry, but I didn't need her words to find my closure. I had already found it deep in the quiet strength I'd built for myself. And as I pulled the bread from the oven and let the warmth fill the room, I knew that I was exactly where I was meant to be. Whole, free, and unshakably certain of my own worth. The house felt different after Linda left. The air seemed clearer, as if her presence had been a cloud that finally lifted. I stood in the kitchen, listening to the hum of the refrigerator, the soft tick of the clock on the wall. Even those small sounds felt more alive, more real. I took a deep breath and let it fill me, a quiet exhale of everything I'd been holding on to. The past wasn't something I could erase, but it wasn't the cage it had once been. I could feel that truth settle into my bones, warm and steady. Mark noticed the change in me almost immediately. That evening, as we sat together on the couch, he reached for my hand and held it in his lap. "You seem lighter," he said, his voice a gentle question. I nodded, a small smile tugging at my lips. "I am," I said. And I was. I told him about Linda's visit, about the apology I never thought I'd hear. He listened, his thumb brushing over my knuckles as I spoke. When I finished, he leaned forward and pressed his forehead to mine. "I'm proud of you," he murmured. The words sank into me like sunlight, and I let them in without hesitation. In the days that followed, I found myself reclaiming the small pieces of my life that I'd let slip away. I spent hours in the garden, my fingers digging into the dark soil as I planted seeds and pulled up old roots. There was something healing in that work, something that reminded me of the way new growth could come from even the hardest ground. I baked bread and shared it with neighbors, the warm loaves a small offering of connection and comfort. I let the scent of fresh herbs fill the kitchen, the tang of rosemary and basil sharp in the air. Each act was a quiet testament to the life I was building piece by piece, and through it all, Mark was there, steady and sure, his presence a constant reminder that I wasn't alone in this journey. We spent long evenings talking, sharing the hopes and fears we'd once kept hidden from each other. It felt like we were learning how to be partners all over again, learning how to trust, not just each other, but ourselves. One night, as we sat together in the soft glow of the lamplight, I told him about the dreams that had begun to take shape in the corners of my mind. "I've been thinking about going back to school." I said, the words tentative but hopeful. "Maybe getting a certification, something just for me." He smiled, his eyes bright with quiet pride. "I think that's a wonderful idea," he said. "You deserve to do something that's yours." I let the warmth of his words settle over me, a promise that I could carry forward. The next day, I made the first call. It was just an inquiry, a small step, but it felt monumental. As I hung up the phone, I realized that I wasn't just moving on from Linda. I was moving on from the version of myself who had always been afraid to ask for more. Each day brought new challenges, but they didn't feel insurmountable anymore. They felt like invitations, opportunities to grow, to learn, to become someone I could be proud of. One afternoon, I sat in the backyard with a cup of tea, watching the sunlight dance through the leaves of the old oak tree. The same tree Linda and I had once sat under, sharing secrets and laughter. It was strange to look at it now, to see how it had weathered storms and seasons, and still stood tall. I thought about everything that tree had witnessed, the way it had grown, despite the harsh winds and cold winters. And I thought about how I was learning to do the same. I closed my eyes and let the quiet fill me, a soft peace that felt both fragile and unbreakable. I didn't know what the future would hold. There would be more challenges, more moments, when doubt would whisper at the edges of my mind. But I also knew that I was stronger than I had ever been. Stronger than the fear that had once kept me silent. Stronger than the doubts that had been sown in me by someone else's bitterness. That evening, as I stood at the stove stirring a pot of soup, Mark came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist. "You're glowing," he said, his breath warm against my ear. I laughed softly, leaning back against him. "I feel like I'm finally starting to see myself again," I said. He kissed my cheek, a quiet promise of love and support. "I always saw you," he said, "even when you couldn't." The words brought tears to my eyes, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of release, of gratitude for the way love could heal even the deepest wounds. As we sat down to dinner that night, I looked around the table and let myself feel the fullness of that moment. The warmth of the food, the steady light of the candles, the quiet comfort of being exactly where I needed to be. Linda's shadow no longer hung over me like a storm cloud. It had become something smaller, something distant and powerless. And in its place, there was light. There was possibility. There was the quiet certainty that I was enough just as I was. I knew there would be days when I still felt the echoes of her voice in my mind, days when I'd have to remind myself of the strength I'd found. But I also knew that I could do that I was capable of choosing myself over and over again. As the night settled around us and the house grew quiet, I sat with Mark in the gentle hush and let myself believe in the future we were building together. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and it was ours. And as I drifted off to sleep, I knew that no matter what else lay ahead, I was ready to meet it. I had found my voice again, and I wasn't going to let anyone take it from me. Spring had begun to creep into the air by the time I realized just how much had changed. The garden out back was coming alive with color, tiny shoots of green pushing their way through the earth, delicate blossoms unfolding like small miracles. I stood there one morning, my hands wrapped around a warm mug of tea, and let the quiet beauty of it settle into my bones. It felt like the world was offering me a second chance, and for the first time, I was ready to take it. I spent my days tending to the new growth, kneeling in the dirt, feeling the sun warm my skin, and marveling at how life always found a way to begin again. Each new bloom felt like a promise that healing was possible, that the future didn't have to be defined by the past. Mark watched me with quiet pride, his eyes soft whenever he caught me smiling at the daffodils that lined the fence. One evening, as we sat together on the porch, watching the light fade, he reached for my hand. "You're different," he said. His voice was gentle, but there was no question in it. "Stronger," he added. I nodded, feeling the truth of that settle into my chest. "I think I finally understand what it means to let go," I said softly. He squeezed my hand. "I see it every day," he said. "And I'm so proud of you." His words were like balm on old wounds, a quiet reassurance that I wasn't alone in this journey. I thought about everything I'd let go of: the anger, the bitterness, the need to prove myself to someone who would never be satisfied. Linda's voice still echoed in the back of my mind, sometimes a ghost of the woman who had once held so much power over me. But now when I heard her words, they felt distant, like an echo fading into nothing. One morning, I found an old photograph of Linda and me tucked away in a drawer I rarely opened. We were laughing in the picture, our arms slung around each other's shoulders, eyes bright with the kind of trust that only comes from years of shared history. I studied it for a long time, feeling a pang of something I couldn't quite name. It wasn't regret, not anymore. It was a quiet sadness for what we'd lost, a gentle mourning for the friendship that had once felt unbreakable. I slipped the photograph back into the drawer and closed it. Some things were better left in the past, and I was learning to leave them there. In the evenings, I sat in the soft glow of the living room, a book open in my lap, and the steady rhythm of Mark's breathing beside me. The house felt different, warmer somehow, more like home. It was a slow kind of healing, the kind that didn't come all at once, but grew in quiet, steady moments. There were still days when the old fears crept in around the edges, when I felt the weight of Linda's betrayal like a bruise that hadn't quite faded. But I was learning to meet those days with gentleness, to remind myself that healing wasn't about pretending the past hadn't happened. It was about refusing to let it define me. One afternoon, I went for a long walk through the neighborhood, the air soft with the scent of new growth and rain. I thought about the woman I'd been when this all began, how small and unsure she'd felt, how tightly she'd clung to the idea that she had to earn her worth. And I thought about the woman I was now, rooted, grounded, and unafraid to claim the space she deserved. As I walked, I let the memories come, each one a stepping stone that had brought me to this moment. Linda's threats, the way she'd tried to twist my life into something I didn't recognize. The way her voice had once echoed louder than my own, and then the quiet courage that had grown in the spaces she'd left behind. I paused at a small park and sat on a weathered bench, feeling the sun warm my face. Children laughed in the distance, their voices bright and clear. I let myself smile the sound of their laughter, a reminder that joy could still find me, even in the smallest moments. I closed my eyes and breathed in the scent of fresh grass and blooming flowers, letting it fill me up. When I opened my eyes again, I felt lighter, like I'd finally let go of something I hadn't even realized I was still carrying. Back at home, I found Mark in the kitchen, humming softly as he chopped vegetables for dinner. He looked up when I walked in, his smile easy and warm. "Good walk?" he asked. "It was," I said, crossing the room to press a kiss to his cheek. I think, I think I'm finally ready to really move forward." He set the knife down and turned to face me, his hands warm as they cupped my face. "You already have," he said. "You've been moving forward every day." I let his words settle into my heart, a quiet affirmation of everything I'd been working toward. That night, as we sat down to eat, I realized how much had changed in the simple act of sharing a meal. The laughter, the easy conversation, it felt like the foundation of something solid, something real. And as I looked across the table at Mark, I felt a surge of gratitude for the love that had stayed steady, even when everything else felt uncertain. Linda's voice might have once been the loudest in my head, but it wasn't anymore. My own voice had grown stronger, rooted in the quiet certainty that I was enough just as I was. And as I cleared the plates and wiped down the counters, I felt that certainty settle into me like the warmth of the spring sun. I didn't know what the future would bring. There would still be hard days, still be moments when the past tried to pull me back. But I also knew that I had everything I needed to face them, because I wasn't the same woman I'd been. I was stronger, I was whole, and I was ready to keep growing. The house was quiet in the early morning light, the soft sounds of the world just beginning to stir. I stood at the window, a mug of coffee warming my hands, and watched the first rays of the sun paint the sky in gentle hues of gold and pink. There was a kind of peace in that quiet, a promise that no matter how dark the night had been, morning would always come. I thought about how far I'd come from the woman who had once been too afraid to speak, about the days when Linda's words had been chains around my heart, binding me to a life that wasn't really mine. And I thought about the journey that had brought me here to this quiet moment of reflection and resolve. Mark joined me at the window, his arm wrapping around my shoulders, as he pressed a soft kiss to my temple. "You're up early," he murmured. "Couldn't sleep," I said. "Too much on my mind." He smiled, his eyes warm and steady. "Good things, I hope," he said. "Mostly," I replied, letting the truth of that sink in. There were still echoes of doubt that whispered in the corners of my mind, but they didn't hold the same power they once had. I was learning to let them go, to trust the quiet strength I'd found in myself. Over the next few days, I made small changes in the house, clearing out old closets, painting a room a bright, hopeful shade of green. Each act felt like a declaration that I was here, that this space was mine, that I was building something new and true. Linda's presence was a distant memory, now a shadow that no longer lingered in the corners of my life. When I thought of her, it was with a sense of calm acceptance. She had been a part of my story, but she no longer defined it. One afternoon, I sat in the garden, my hands deep in the warm soil, and thought about the seeds I'd planted, each one a quiet testament to the future I was choosing for myself, a future rooted in growth and renewal. Mark came out to join me, kneeling in the dirt beside me. He reached for my hand, his fingers brushing mine, as we worked side by side. "You've built something beautiful here," he said, his voice low and sure. "Not just the garden, the life you've made, the person you've become." I felt the truth of his words settle into me, a quiet affirmation of everything I'd fought for. "I finally feel like I'm where I'm meant to be," I said softly. He smiled, his eyes bright with pride. "I'm glad," he said. "You deserve to feel that way." That night, as we sat together in the living room, I found myself thinking about the woman I used to be, the woman who had believed her worth was something she had to earn from others. I thought about how much I'd given away to keep the peace, how much I'd lost in the process. And I thought about how it felt now to stand in my own strength and know that it was enough. I picked up my phone and scrolled through the contacts list, pausing at Linda's name. I didn't feel anger or fear as I looked at it, just a quiet certainty that I didn't need to hold on to that piece of my past any longer. With a steady breath, I pressed delete. It felt like a small act, but it was a powerful one. A final letting go of the hold she'd once had on my heart. Mark watched me, his expression calm and understanding. "You're really done," he said. I nodded. "I am," I said, and I meant it. As I set the phone down, I felt a lightness in my chest, a quiet joy that had nothing to do with anyone else, and everything to do with the woman I'd become. The next morning, I woke up early and went for a walk, the sky soft with the promise of dawn. I breathed in the crisp air, feeling the earth solid beneath my feet, and let the gentle rhythm of my steps ground me in the present. I thought about the journey I'd taken, how it had been messy and painful at times, but also how it had shaped me into someone stronger, someone truer. And I thought about the future bright and uncertain, and wide open in front of me. As I walked back home, I felt a quiet thrill in my chest, a sense of possibility that felt like the soft glow of the sunrise. I knew there would be challenges ahead. There always are. But I also knew that I was ready to face them, to keep choosing myself, and the life I wanted one small step at a time. Back at home, I found Mark in the kitchen, his hands busy at the stove. He looked up as I came in, his smile lighting up the room. "Good walk?" he asked. The best, I said. And it was true, because for the first time in a long time, I felt free. Linda's words had once been the loudest voice in my head, but they weren't anymore. My own voice was louder now, clear and steady and true, and I wasn't afraid to use it. I sat down at the table, the smell of fresh coffee and warm bread filling the room, and let myself savor the quiet joy of that moment. This was my life, imperfect, but mine, and I was done apologizing for it. As the sun rose higher in the sky, and the world came alive around me, I felt a surge of hope, a promise that no matter what lay ahead, I had everything I needed to meet it. Because I was enough. Because I had always been enough. And as I closed my eyes and let that truth settle into my bones, I knew that this wasn't the end. It was just the beginning of everything I was meant to be. If you've ever felt like someone's words had the power to define you, know this. You have the power to reclaim your story. You have the strength to let go of what no longer serves you and choose the life you truly deserve. So take a deep breath, stand in your truth, and start writing your own new chapter today.
So,